Hey y'all, this is Brown at IF Brown, and today we're going to be talking about a story from Marvel Comics Presents called Children of the Beast, starring Werewolf by Night, aka Jack Russell. And this story took place within issues 54 through 59 of the book Marvel Comics Presents, and this was all within the year of 1990. And I never got a chance to read any of the stories from the character's own book, which was also called Werewolf by Night, which was a hit horror title in the 70s. And one of the things that the series is remembered for, other than the fact that it was, by most accounts, a well done horror title, was the fact that it introduced the character of Moon Knight, aka Mark Spector, to the world. And so, other than knowing a few tidbits here and there of information about the character, I didn't know a whole lot about him. And so, having read the story Children of the Beast kind of gave me an appreciation for who the character was and what his story was. And part of that is because Len Kaminski, the writer of the story Children of the Beast, is oftentimes known as a very good horror writer. And case in point, the first eight issues of the series Morbius, which came a little bit later in the 90s. And so it was interesting seeing him take a shot at writing a werewolf title before he had gotten the role of writer for a vampire title. But I also know that Len Kaminski is a good writer because he came up with some very good Iron Man stories, and so he's skilled in writing both horror and non-horror titles. But Kaminski did a good job of, say, letting the reader know what's been going on with this character prior to this story in just a couple of panels, so that way once the story gets going, we're not lost. If, say, for example, we've never read anything with the character before and this is our first time seeing him in action, and so even if it's our first look at the character, the story does a good job of making sure you know who he is and what's been going on with him. But another reason I wanted to review this particular story is because there is kind of a Ghost Rider connection, because in between issues 24 and 25 of the 90s Ghost Rider series, which featured Danny Ketch as the new Ghost Rider, there were quite a few Ghost Rider stories that took place in Marvel Comics Presents. And one of those stories, or I should say storylines, featured Ghost Rider teaming up with the Werewolf by Night against some villains that had first made their appearance within the story Children of the Beast. And so, having read the Ghost Rider and Werewolf team-up story prior to reading this solo werewolf story, I think kind of made me realize that it would make more sense, or the story, I think, would have made more sense had I read the Children of the Beast story prior to the Ghost Rider and Werewolf team-up story. And so that's why I'm going to go ahead and review this particular werewolf story, so that way when I eventually do get to the Ghost Rider and Werewolf team-up story, certain elements from that storyline will make sense because I've already discussed the werewolf story here, Children of the Beast. And so the story kicks off with the character of Jack Russell trying to find a cure for his curse, because it turns out it's kind of like a family lineage thing, in the sense that his father passed it on to him, and so when he became 18, that's when he first transformed into a werewolf. And so he's had kind of a sporadic, career wherein, or I guess you could say, a sporadic life wherein he tries a career as a superhero or some form of hero, and only to be met with mixed results, because at the end of the day, he is a monster with little control over, his werewolf persona or his werewolf side. And so there were times where he thought that he was getting a sense of control over his werewolf part, but unfortunately, the werewolf aspect of himself was just pure beast, and in some instances was just biding its time until it came loose and basically showed that no, Jack really wasn't making much in the way of progress. And so a lot of his life is spent alone in trying to contain himself to where whenever a certain time of the month comes into play, wherein it's a full moon, he locks himself away in a sort of a secured area wherein he can't get out, and neither can the werewolf once he transforms into the werewolf. But he's tried multiple times to find some remedy for his situation, and his most recent attempt involved him getting a hold of some I guess you could say manuscripts containing elements of dark magic. And so once he got all the proper ingredients in place to where he was able to perform a ritual, he conjured up the shade of his father to try and ask him if he could at least point him in the right direction, because he knows that his father, who is long since passed away, had tried to find a cure for the curse, but or at least had made some headway in terms of research. But unfortunately, his father's shade tells him that there is no cure, and the best that you can do is try and make peace with your werewolf side. Because apparently, we're talking like way back in ancient times, those who were cursed with being a werewolf oftentimes saw it as a blessing, because at this point in time, humanity was more in touch with, I guess you could say, the elements of nature. And so with that in mind, those who were werewolves were more in harmony with their monstrous side. But over time, though, humanity lost touch with their connection to nature, or the earth, as it were. And so that's what ended up resulting in werewolves becoming more and more savage over time. And so his father, or Jack's father, had basically concluded that the best thing that one can do if they're afflicted with a werewolf curse is basically try and make peace with their werewolf side on, like maybe kind of in the way of, say, meditation or something like that, or go into a state of being where your human side is able to come to terms with your werewolf side. So that way, when the person does transform into a werewolf, they're not constantly fighting with that part of themselves, and vice versa. And so Jack is ultimately very crushed and deflated by this revelation, because this is something that he's struggled with since he was 18. And while he has managed to do some good in his time as a werewolf, oftentimes he ends up doing a lot more harm than good. And so he was really hoping that he could find a way to not be a monster anymore. But after having literally summoned the shade of his father, and his father literally telling him there is no cure, the best you can do is say, just shake hands with the beast. Leaves him kind of shattered. But unfortunately, things don't end there, because there is a sort of a self-appointed hunter of werewolves called Isiah Curwen, aka Silver Dagger, who has something of a cult following of people who hunt down werewolves and kill them by way of implementing silver, one of the guaranteed weaknesses of werewolves. And so while he's been hunting Jack Russell, there's a series of murders that have been plaguing various cities, and they seem to be following Jack Russell. And basically, these murders are coming about due to a gang of biker werewolves called the Brain Eaters. And so the Brain Eaters, it turns out, were in fact, in a way, the offspring of Jack Russell, because back in his own series, he had run afoul of a street gang, or a biker gang, and they had tried to take him down, thinking that their numbers would overwhelm him. But him being a werewolf, he easily made short work of them. But they survived the maulings and basically were afflicted with the werewolf curse, by way of, Jack having, say, bitten them or, slashed them and passing the curse on to them. And so these gang members, they embraced their monstrous side and have basically been, doing what they would ordinarily do as a gang, which is cause all sorts of chaos and murder, but also doing so as werewolves. And so the character of Silver Dagger, aka Curwen, has been trying to find the source of this werewolf outbreak and was able to trace it to Jack Russell. And so he and his cult, they track Jack Russell down, and this is right after Jack has finished conversing with the shade of his father, and so he's already in a shaken state of mind when Curwen finds him and breaks into his home and basically calls him out. And so at first Jack's trying to figure out what the hell's going on, but then he sees that the moon's coming out, like the full moon's coming out, and which in turn triggers his transformation. And so instead of outright fighting Curwen, once he transforms into the werewolf, as a werewolf, he's able to see that this guy is literally covered in silver, like his garments have silver, his weaponry is silver. And so as a werewolf, he knows that this is big trouble. And so he hightails it out of his home by bursting through a window and running into the woods. But Curwen gives chase, and the two of them fight. And unfortunately, though, Curwen is easily able to grievously injure the werewolf, because of his silver weaponry. And so as he basically crawls away to die, as he's bleeding out, he's saved by the Brain Eaters, because they've been actually trying to find him this whole time. And so they're able to rescue him and take him with them. And as he transforms back into Jack Russell, he kind of gets to know some of them, or at least one of them, kind of the leader of the pack. She's basically trying to seduce him and bring him over to their side. And he wants to give in. I mean, he wants to give in to the monster within and just shuck off the constraints of humanity. But he can't bring himself to fully embrace his monstrous side, because if he does that, then any semblance of humanity will forever be lost. And so the Brain Eaters basically call him out on his hypocrisy, in the sense that he's the one who'd made them into monsters. And so prior to them having crossed paths with him, they'd just been an ordinary biker gang. I mean, they'd caused some destruction here and there, but it wasn't until Jack turned them into werewolves by way of their violent encounter in the past. And it wasn't until then that they fully embraced their monstrous personas, is when they literally became monsters. And so a fight breaks out, and this is all in a drive-in theater where, ironically, the original Wolfman's playing. And so Jack sees that these Brain Eaters, I mean, their name isn't just a figure of speech. Like, they literally eat people's brains, as well as people in general, because they actually start to transform into werewolves voluntarily and start murdering the people in the crowd. And so Jack is able to transform into the werewolf because of the full moon, and he puts up a fight against the werewolves that are his opponents. But after an explosion, due to a cigarette hitting a bunch of gasoline, or a lit cigarette hitting a bunch of gasoline, both sides are wounded. And so the werewolf basically slinks away to find a place to die, because, I mean, he'd already been badly hurt by Curwen, and he was healing up from that. But him having been mauled by a bunch of werewolves, just basically made his injuries that much worse. And so he slinks off into Death Valley and finds a cave to just basically curl up and maybe sleep, maybe die. But as he transforms back into Jack, the two of them have this encounter in the mind where Jack, in sort of this ethereal spectral form, is able to make contact with this werewolf side, and he sees how the werewolf side of him has felt like a prisoner all these years, and he realizes that the only way that the two of them can survive this encounter or this, I guess you could say, this struggle, and not only to survive against, say, the Brain Eaters and Curwen and his crew, but just to survive going forward in the future, is that the two of them basically have to make peace with one another. And so Jack's sort of spectral or mental form is able to free the restraints on his werewolf side, and the two of them basically kind of come together and bond in a way of understanding. And so once Jack recovers, once he transforms back into a werewolf, it's more like, he has all the werewolf instincts and all the werewolf's power set skills, but he also has his human intelligence. And so it's like the two are literally one now. And so they return to engage the Brain Eaters and Curwen's people, and it turns out it's kind of like a three-way fight, in the sense that the werewolf, or Jack Russell, is trying to fight the Brain Eaters and Curwen's crew, and Curwen's crew are trying to fight the Brain Eaters and Jack, and the Brain Eaters are trying to fight Curwen's crew and Jack. And so it's like a three-way fight, and what ultimately ends up happening is the majority of the Brain Eaters are taken out by the group of hunters, but also the hunters are overwhelmed by the Brain Eaters. And so it's like both sides have grievous losses, and Jack and Curwen end up fighting one another once more, except this time, because there's kind of the human intellect in charge of the werewolf body, he's able to basically tap into the instinct, where it's like he's able to use all his raw ferocity as a werewolf, but he's able to do so intelligently. And so this time he actually beats Curwen, and he bites him, and basically makes Curwen think that he's given him the werewolf curse. Except the thing is, because the two of them are working together now, as in the werewolf and Jack has control over who he passes the curse on to now. So just because he bites someone or cuts someone doesn't mean that that person's necessarily going to become a werewolf, only if he wills it. And so he's not going to pass the curse on to Curwen, but he's not going to tell him that. And so he leaves the scene, and he doesn't really know what happened to the remaining Brain Eaters, because as far as he could tell, the majority of them, if not all of them, were killed in the battle. And the same thing for Curwen's crew. But he has an idea of what may have happened to Curwen, because as he was walking away, the few survivors from Curwen's crew turned on him, seeing that he had been bitten by a werewolf. And so the only cure for that was to kill him. And so, Curwen's like, why have you forsaken me, Lord? Because this whole time he was convinced that he was doing the Lord's work by leading people to hunt werewolves, and especially Jack Russell, since he was the root cause of, the Brain Eaters literally becoming monsters. And so the story ends with Jack, actually looking forward to, further nights with a form of optimism now, because he knows that he and the beast within have made a sort of peace with one another, whereas those who have either given in to their monstrous side or lost touch with their humanity. I mean, they're basically their own worst enemies, whereas he's a monster who's still human. And so that's how the story ends, as he rides off into the night on his motorcycle. But I thought that this was a pretty good story, and I think that it did, like I said earlier, it did a really good job of making the reader aware of who Jack Russell was as a character, as well as say what it is to be a werewolf, or what it's like for him to be a werewolf. Because Kaminski does a good job of switching from in between perspectives. You got the human perspective, but you also have the werewolf perspective, and so it's like two different mindsets, and he does a really good job of conveying both mindsets, both perspectives. And James Fry does a really good job on the artwork as well, because it really does look like something from an old school horror comic, but at the same time, like say from horror comics from the 70s, like say something from Man-Thing or something like that. But this being written in 1990, it doesn't feel dated at all, though. So there is still that old school horror vibe, and I love the shout out where they're at the drive-in and the Wolfman's playing on the big screen. I mean, that was a nice touch, I thought. So there is that old school horror vibe, but at the same time, there's an aspect of it to where, in terms of the writing, where it doesn't feel, say, out of place or out of its time or just dated, And so I also, thought that, I don't know if it was intentional, but the part of the drive-in theater where the brain eaters just start chowing down on the other people in the drive-in theater, like pulling them out of their cars and start biting them and slashing them and what have you, kind of made me think of that scene from the vampire movie Lost Boys, where they're on the beach and the vampires just tear the people apart. It kind of made me think of that. So seeing as how that was from 1986, I think, or was it 87? Anyways, seeing as how Lost Boy was in the late 80s and Children of the Beast was in 1990, there may have been kind of a some inspiration there, but I'm not 100% sure. But I thought that was pretty cool. I mean, it was a very good horror moment, because it's like you see, I mean, not just that moment, but just in general, I thought this was a good horror story, because you see Jack being plagued by nightmares wherein he is his own worst enemy. I mean, because of the beast within, and then you see that exquisitely illustrated series of panels where he's summoning the shade of his father, and his father is this spectral form that's sort of distorted and humanoid still, but distorted and just nightmarish looking, but just desperately telling his son that there is no cure, and the best he could do is try and make peace with the monster within and what have you. I mean, it was good on a visual standpoint, but it was also good on a psychological standpoint, because you really get the idea that Jack's been trying to find a cure for years now, and just to be told that there is no cure, I mean, it's something that crushes him. But I thought that the story did a good job of making you sympathize with the character of Jack Russell, and also with the werewolf as well, because I mean, when he has that first fight with Curwen, or Silver Dagger, as it were, I think, yeah, Silver Dagger. I think, the creative team did a good job of making it to where there was definitely an element of horror, in the sense that we saw just how savage the werewolf was, but then when he's met with an opponent who can easily outfight him because of his silver weaponry, I mean, you kind of feel sorry for him because of how badly he's hurt and what have you. It's like seeing a dog be mortally wounded and what have you, and or watching a dog die or something like that. And so those of you who are listening to this who have pets or something, maybe you can understand the feeling. But so yeah, I mean, they did a good job of making you sympathize with both Jack and the werewolf. And I also thought it was interesting how the leader of the Brain Eaters, even though she was definitely a villain who was already evil beforehand, before she was turned into a werewolf, but is even worse now because she's literally a monster. I mean, I thought it was interesting, though, having her be the one to kind of call out Jack for being the one to turn him into monsters in the first place. And so when he's saying he can't be one of them because he can't give in, to his monstrous side, she's pointing out how hypocritical it was because, when he had turned them into monsters, he had definitely given into his monstrous side at that point. But I guess you could argue that this was like early on in his life as a werewolf, and so he didn't really have much in the way of an ability to kind of fight the beast within. But still, it was interesting seeing how his own children, as it were, kind of called him out for being the one who made them. And so, it's just one of those things that it's interesting when the villains kind of have a point and what have you. But speaking of villains having a point, I did think that the idea of kind of this cult of hunters that are made up of people who are specifically hunting werewolves and equipped with silver and what have you, like silver bullets, silver blades. I mean, it was kind of like a group of vampire hunters, except, if they were hunting werewolves. And so you have these moments where you get excerpts from Curwen's journal, and you see how much of an obsession this is for him. And even to a point where, he willingly kills people just for having been slashed by a werewolf, just to, do away with any chance of a new werewolf being born. But for him, though, and for the members of the cult, it doesn't give them any pleasure to do so. The only pleasure they get is from when, they kill someone who's a full-on werewolf, as opposed to, say, someone who was an unfortunate victim of a werewolf, like just putting them out of their misery. But the only thing that I think could have improved, at least as far as Curwen's character goes, is, we've come to find that they're hunting Jack because he's the one who basically made the Brain Eaters by way of turning them into werewolves. But at the same time, excuse me, at the same time, though, we don't really get much in the way of, say, development of their characters. Like, we don't know why. Like, we kind of understand why he himself is doing it. Like, he's kind of a religious zealot. But at the same time, we don't know if maybe he lost someone to the Brain Eaters, or some of the members of his group have lost someone to the Brain Eaters. I feel like maybe if there had been a bit of a flashback with either him or some of the members of his group, maybe just, some bits of dialogue talking about, having lost someone to the Brain Eaters, or even to Jack himself when he was in werewolf form, I think that would have made more sense for them to have made the decision to form this group to go after the Brain Eaters and in turn Jack Russell. But we don't really get much in the way of that form of development. And so as satisfying as it is to see Jack psych the leader of this group out by making him think that he's been turned into a werewolf because Jack bit him, especially after the near fatal beating that he had given to the werewolf earlier in the story. I think that there are moments during this final battle where Jack in werewolf form is calling out Curwen and his group of hunters as a bunch of mindless, fanatics who fear what they don't understand, and what they don't understand they destroy. Kind of like some of the lines of dialogue from the movie Nightbreed. But seeing as how we don't see anything in the way of, say, a humanizing moment with any of the other werewolves other than Jack himself, you know, it kind of, and we just always see of them is when they're giving into their monstrous side willingly and gleefully torturing and slaughtering people. I mean, when you have something like that going on, it makes it difficult for the reader, or at least for me, to say sympathize with these other werewolves, because we see how evil they are. And so, you know, who's worse? You know, the werewolves who are willingly giving in to their animal instincts and taking pleasure in torturing someone, or the group of people who are hunting them down. And so Jack's somewhere in between, because he's a monster, but he still has, you know, a semblance of humanity, and, you know, he makes the distinction between right and wrong. And so obviously, I mean, you know, the reader's meant to sympathize with him, you know, entirely in the matter. But I just think that when, you know, he says what he says to Curwen about him and his people fearing what they don't understand and what have you, I think that line would have had more of an impact or more staying power if we had had some humanizing moments with maybe, you know, members of the Brain Eaters or what have you. Like maybe some of them were just along for the ride, but they weren't, you know, straight up evil people, you know, that kind of thing, you know. But we don't really get anything like that. We just get that these are people who were a biker gang who are already chaotic, but now they're even more so because they're werewolves. So we don't really feel any sympathy for them. And so, I mean, I just think that that particular line of dialogue that Jack says to Curwen, it feels kind of out of place, you know. And it just, I think maybe if it comes across as a little preachy in a way. But I mean, other than that though, I mean, you know, the Brain Eaters were definitely a very scary threat for, you know, the main character, as well as just as monsters in general. And then of course, you know, Curwen and his crew, you know, proved to be, you know, a major threat as well, because Curwen himself, you know, albeit because he was equipped with silver, was nearly able to kill Jack, you know, and before Jack had made peace with his werewolf side. And then of course, you know, there you see in the battle that members of Curwen's crew were able to kill some of the Brain Eaters, and so it wasn't like a one-sided fight. And so both sides were threats to the main character, as well as to each other, obviously. So I do appreciate that both sides were dangerous. And so it was nice to see Jack finally, you know, coming to terms with the fact that there was no cure, but at the very least he was able to make peace with his monstrous side. And so that way, when we get that sort of, you know, semi-optimistic ending where, you know, he's looking, you know, forward to the future now and exploring this new life, in the sense that he and the monster are now one. And, you know, it was a nice touch of optimism, I thought. I mean, it was a bit of hope for someone who had been struggling with something dark for a long time. So I'm going to go ahead and give Children of the Beast 4 out of 5 stars. It was a good horror story, and, you know, it was a good werewolf story too. So real quick, I'll show y'all some of the artwork here. I'll show y'all the cover art. So here's issue 54, and here you got, you know, a Jack or the werewolf in the corner here, but you turn it around, it is right there. Then you got 55, and you turn it around, there he is. Then you got 56, you turn it around. Really good artwork. I think this is, yeah, it's Steve Lytle. Steve Lytle did this cover. It's probably my favorite one here. Then you got 57 with artwork by Dale Kuhn, who was a good artist on The Incredible Hulk, and he created the character Pitt for Image Comics. You turn it around. There he is off in the corner there. And you got 58. There's a werewolf in the corner again. And you turn it around, you got him right here. And last but not least, you got 59. You turn it around, and there he is at the bottom there. You know, that's Silver Dagger, aka Curwen. But real quick, I'll show you some of the interior art, you know, just so you'll see what I was talking about, how he got that sort of nightmarish old school horror vibe, but at the same time it doesn't feel dated. But this is when Jack's having, you know, a nightmare. There he is, you know, seeing like his decomposing father right there in this nightmare. And I love how you've got this sort of Bill Siekiewicz-like artwork here. I mean, it's James Fry doing the artwork, but it looks like Sieckiewicz's work on the Demon Bear from New Mutants or something. But definitely looks nightmarish and monstrous, you know, the beast within. And so and there's the leader of the Brain Eaters right there. And I like how, on one hand, I mean, it's kind of obscured by shadow, you know, but at the same time, you see that she's clearly, torn the guy apart, you know, left him for dead, bleeding out, and what have you. Ah, here we are. And this is when Jack's summoning the shade of his father here. Really good horror art. But then, and this is when he's going up against Silver Dagger, and he sees, you know, through the eyes of, you know, who he is as a werewolf, and he sees that all the silver here is basically setting off all these alarms. And here they are at the theater, right here. And there's a scene from the Wolfman on the screen there. Like I said, I thought that was a nice touch. And I liked how there's a bit of eroticism here, in a sense that, you know, the leader of the Brain Eaters, you know, she's trying to seduce Jack into giving in to them, even though there's almost like an incestuous undertone, in a sense that they're his quote-unquote children, you know, so a bit of erotic horror there. Right, real quick. So this is where you get the Lost Boys-like moment. You know, you got the Brain Eaters giving in to their wild side, and Jack, you know, trying to fight it every step of the way. And then gradually it comes over, and you get the full-on slaughter of people. And Jack realizes that, you know, these werewolves literally eat people's brains. And so I love this art right here. So this is where there's that sort of spiritual experience where Jack and, you know, the werewolf, they basically come to terms with one another. And I love how it's almost like Steve Ditko-like artwork, in the sense of looking like something from Doctor Strange in a roundabout way. And then you kind of go to Bill Siekiewicz-like artwork here, some of that Demon Bear vibe. And finally, the two become one. But, sorry, let me get a better picture there. And I know this page always kind of looked cartoony to me, but at the same time, it kind of looks like something you'd see from a magazine like Heavy Metal. You know, like something like a bunch of werewolves coming at you, and, you know, and it's from the perspective of the gun lens. And here you got the battle between all three sides, or some of it. And here's Jack, getting payback on Silver Dagger here. And actually, turning the tables on him. And then he bites him, making him think that he's passed the werewolf curse on to him. And he goes off and he walks away, leaving Curwen to his doom. There we go. Final page. He goes off into the moonlight with a bit of optimism. He kind of looks like Johnny Blaze, the original Ghost Rider here, how he looked in his own book. But yeah, so there you go. That was Children of the Beast. It was a good horror story, and it kind of gave me an appreciation for the character of Werewolf by Night. And I definitely look forward to rereading that Ghost Rider and Werewolf team-up story wherein the Brain Eaters come back. And so now that I know who they are and how they came about, I think I might be able to more adequately review that particular werewolf story in the future. And so I look forward to doing that. I mean, there are a few stories I gotta get to before that take place in between this story and that one. But once I get to that particular Ghost Rider and Werewolf team-up story, I'll definitely make sure to put a link to the review for this story, Children of the Beast, in the description for that review. So anyway, yeah, 4 out of 5 stars for Children of the Beast. So thank you very much for taking the time to check this out. If you like what you see here, feel free to like and subscribe. And you all have a good day. Take care. Bye.